know what I mean? It's not like it's a landlord-tenant issue.
It is the landlord.
I mean, it is.
This is Regis.
Mr. Marshall appears to be absolutely correct in that this is a civil matter, and so if he needs to get into the office, he's going to need to contact his lawyer and sue civilly in order to get into the office. Right. You're correct.
The situation began when building management sought to evict Marshall from his...
The tension begins almost immediately, a deceptively mundane workday erupting into a confrontation that challenges fundamental rights. At 00:02:15, the video captures the moment that crystallizes the balance, or imbalance, of authority in this encounter. Roland Eder, a mechanic performing his routine work at a client's vehicle, is approached by law enforcement under suspicion that is tenuous at best. The officer's approach is aggressive, not investigative. This instant sets the tone for the rest of the encounter, a clash between institutional power and lawful individual action. From the moment Officer McCabe arrives on the scene, her posture, tone, and insistence on compliance elevate a procedural inquiry into a question of dominance, transforming a civil matter into a constitutional test. At the core of this interaction is the officer's demand for Eder's identification. It is presented as an unquestionable authority, yet under Alabama law, specifically Section 15-530, officers cannot demand a driver's license or physical ID absent reasonable suspicion or a traffic stop. Eder, aware of his rights, calmly refuses to comply, explaining that his ID is located in his car and that his actions are fully lawful. Despite this, the officers persist. The Bodycam footage captures the officer moving decisively into Eder's personal space, escalating the situation not through threat of violence, but through procedural insistence and repeated verbal demands. The legal threshold for reasonable suspicion is not met, yet the officers continue as if it were. What follows is a study in the dynamics of authority under stress. Eder's compliance with lawful requests, providing explanations, identifying the vehicle, explaining his purpose, stands in stark contrast to the officer's escalating insistence. As each request is deflected, the officer's behavior shifts from routine procedure into what is legally considered an overreach. The insistence on physical identification, the repeated verbal commands, and the mounting implication of obstruction collectively reflect a misunderstanding of statutory limits and constitutional boundaries. The law is clear. Obstruction requires acts that actually hinder governmental operations through force, intimidation, or unlawful acts. Eder's behavior, composed and cooperative, does not meet this threshold. The arrival of Officer Cameron Perilla amplifies this tension. Backup introduces a second layer of authority, which, rather than mitigating the situation, compounds it. Eder remains calm, yet the officer's coordinated insistence on compliance transforms the scene into a power contest. Here, the psychological mechanics of escalation become evident. Compliance is demanded not because the law dictates it, but because ego and institutional reinforcement have supplanted it. Each additional officer validates the preceding actions, layering the perception of legal necessity over a foundation that remains legally weak. The Bodycam captures not only procedural actions, but also tonal shifts that are critical to understanding misuse of authority. Eder's repeated explanations, his calm reasoning, his clarifications regarding the location of his ID are met with sharp, clipped responses and verbal commands. The officer's frustration escalates visibly and audibly, signaling a shift from legal enforcement to ego-driven enforcement. At this stage, the encounter transitions from civil oversight into a disciplinary exercise, with the citizen positioned as a subject to be managed rather than a lawful actor. This moment demonstrates the dangerous interplay between law, perception, and authority. The officers operate under the assumption that refusal equals guilt. They construe non-compliance with unnecessary requests as obstruction, invoking the statute to justify immediate arrest. Yet the law defines obstruction narrowly, and Eder's actions fail to meet this definition. His refusal to provide an ID that is not legally required constitutes lawful behavior, yet the officers frame it as criminal. The cognitive bias of authority must be obeyed drives the escalation, revealing systemic weaknesses in both training and institutional accountability. At 000302, the physical handling begins. The bodycam footage shows the officers moving to secure Eder, applying handcuffs despite his verbal assurances of compliance and readiness to provide identification from the correct location. Here, the intersection of physical control and legal misunderstanding becomes pronounced. The officer's decision to apply handcuffs is framed as a precaution, but in reality, it is the culmination of procedural overreach. This moment exemplifies what legal scholars describe as contingent overreach, the point at which law enforcement authority is extended beyond legal justification, often justified post hoc through assertions of potential obstruction or risk. Eder's response is calm but firm. He reiterates that no crime has been committed and challenges the officer's claims. The bodycam audio reveals an essential element. He is articulate, measured, and consistently within legal bounds. Yet the officer's framing continues to escalate. The scene demonstrates the systemic failure to distinguish between lawful resistance and obstruction, a critical factor in evaluating misuse of authority cases. As the confrontation progresses, additional stressors emerge. Eder's duties as a mechanic, the urgency of attending to a client's vehicle, and the physical context of being at a workplace introduce elements that should mitigate law enforcement intervention. Yet these contextual factors are disregarded. The officers prioritize procedural control over lawful analysis, creating a disproportionate response. Each verbal insistence, each physical adjustment, and each assertion of imminent arrest amplifies the tension and underscores the consequences of unchecked authority. The legal misalignment is compounded by communication breakdowns. Eder requests clarity and verification, asking whom he is legally obligated to comply with and pointing to appropriate contacts. Officer responses are inconsistent, alternating between commands, warnings, and procedural justification. This inconsistency further undermines the legal validity of the encounter. Law enforcement practices in situations of potential constitutional violation require clarity, transparency, and proportionality. Here, the absence of these standards directly contributes to the escalation and sets the stage for the subsequent arrest. The bodycam captures not only verbal and physical interactions, but also the psychological and emotional weight of the encounter. Eder expresses exasperation, concern for his work responsibilities, and disbelief at being treated as criminal for lawful behavior. These human elements are critical to understanding the broader implications of authority misuse. They provide insight into how routine enforcement actions can rapidly transition into constitutional violations when institutional procedures are applied rigidly, without legal calibration, and amplified by personal bias or impatience. The eventual arrest, recorded in the latter segment of Part 1, is less a resolution and more a procedural inevitability given the path of escalation. The officer's interpretation of obstruction, combined with their insistence on ID and procedural dominance, transforms a non-criminal act into grounds for detention. The arrest occurs in a context where Eder has consistently complied with lawful aspects of the inquiry, yet his lawful resistance to overreach triggers the use of handcuffs, public humiliation, and temporary deprivation of liberty. This phase illustrates a broader systemic issue: the transformation of routine oversight into legally tenuous enforcement, driven by cognitive biases, training deficiencies, and insufficient adherence to statutory limits. From a constitutional perspective, this phase highlights key failures. The Fourth Amendment protects against unreasonable seizure, yet Eder is restrained for actions that do not constitute a crime. The First and 14th Amendments, while less directly implicated in this context, underscore the principle that government action must be lawful, proportionate, and transparent. Each of these principles is challenged in this encounter, and the body cam footage serves as a detailed record of how small decisions, compounded by institutional norms, can lead to significant rights violations. Eder's composure, repeated verbal clarifications, and requests for procedural transparency contrast sharply with the officer's insistence on compliance, demonstrating a classic case of authority overreach. Here, the documentary lens emphasizes not sensationalized conflict, but the subtle mechanisms of escalation: verbal insistence, physical positioning, reinforcement through backup, and framing lawful resistance as criminal. This combination creates a legal and ethical dilemma, illustrating why body cam analysis is essential for understanding the dynamics of misuse of authority and for training purposes in law enforcement accountability. By the conclusion of Part 1, the scene has established the legal, psychological, and procedural tensions that will define the rest of the case. Eder's arrest is imminent, not because he committed a crime, but because institutional dynamics and misapplied authority converge to prioritize control over legality. The footage reveals a detailed, real-time map of escalation, providing invaluable insight into how ordinary enforcement interactions can become extraordinary constitutional events when rights are inadequately understood and authority is unchecked. As the situation unfolds, the dynamics of escalation become increasingly clear. Eder's arrest, which begins with procedural insistence, moves into a phase where law enforcement actions are driven less by legal necessity and more by psychological reinforcement of authority. Officers McCabe and Perilla, now acting in concert, interpret lawful resistance as obstruction. Each command and warning layers additional pressure, creating a feedback loop where compliance is demanded, refused, and then treated as evidence of criminality. The body cam reveals the meticulous nature of this escalation. Eder repeatedly offers identification, explaining its lawful location, and the officers continue to insist on immediate production. This insistence, framed as legal authority, is in fact a misapplication of statute. Under Alabama law, the Stop and Identify statute does not require physical ID in non-traffic contexts without reasonable suspicion. By ignoring this legal boundary, the officers create the conditions for a false arrest. The moment is subtle but critical. Authority is exercised not through overt coercion, but through procedural overreach that appears justified in real time. Communication breakdowns further exacerbate the situation. Eder requests clarification and supervisory involvement, yet these requests are delayed or partially fulfilled. Supervisory oversight is intended to correct errors or de-escalate tension. Here, it is largely absent, allowing institutional momentum to continue unchecked. This absence demonstrates a systemic weakness. When authority is applied without verification of legality, escalation becomes self-reinforcing. The psychological dimension is equally significant. Officers express frustration audibly, their tone and cadence shifting as Eder maintains lawful resistance. Bodycam audio captures the subtle interplay of tension, patience, and impatience, highlighting how human factors contribute to misuse of authority. Eder remains calm, yet his lawful behavior is interpreted as defiance. This misperception illustrates a critical lesson in law enforcement accountability. The perception of threat often drives action more than legal standards, particularly in high-stakes or public contexts. The addition of potential legal consequences intensifies the interaction. Obstruction charges are referenced repeatedly, yet the legal definition, hindering government operations through intimidation, force, or unlawful acts, is not met. The officer's insistence on applying this statute demonstrates how misapplied law can serve as a tool for asserting control rather than ensuring justice. Similarly, the discussion of possible resisting arrest charges illustrates the procedural layering that often occurs in contested encounters. Multiple, sometimes redundant legal threats are used to compel compliance. Physical actions, captured in the footage, underscore the escalation. Handcuffing, positioning, and minor searches are applied despite Eder's clear willingness to comply with lawful requests. These actions, while procedurally familiar, are disproportionate in context and illustrate how routine enforcement techniques can be misused when the underlying legal justification is weak. The Bodycam provides a continuous record of these interactions, allowing analysts to trace every step where authority outpaced law. Contextual factors are also critical. Eder's role as a mechanic attending to a client's vehicle adds urgency and legitimacy to his presence. The officer's failure to acknowledge this context reflects a rigid, rule-focused interpretation of authority that disregards situational nuance. In practical terms, this rigidity transforms a lawful activity into a perceived obstruction. The footage highlights how misalignment between law and enforcement perception can escalate minor interactions into constitutional confrontations. Throughout this phase, the potential consequences for Eder become more pronounced. Detention, public embarrassment, and exposure to misdemeanor charges all represent significant personal and professional impacts. The video emphasizes the human cost of procedural overreach. Even when charges are later dismissed, the immediate and enduring consequences for the individual are substantial. This dimension is essential for understanding the stakes in misuse of authority cases. Legality and procedure are not abstract concepts, but directly influence real lives. The escalation is compounded by systemic reinforcement. Backup officers, verbal commands, and repeated warnings create a perception that the situation is under lawful control, despite the underlying legal weakness. This phenomenon demonstrates the interplay of individual judgment and institutional momentum. Once a path of action is set in motion, it is difficult to halt, even if the initial justification is flawed. As the arrest proceeds, Eder's composure remains notable. He continues to assert his rights calmly, providing explanations, offering identification within lawful bounds, and requesting supervisory oversight. The contrast between his behavior and the officer's insistence underscores the dissonance between lawful conduct and perceived obstruction. This phase provides a clear example of how constitutional rights can be challenged in routine enforcement scenarios, particularly when procedural misinterpretations intersect with psychological factors. The legal dimension becomes increasingly salient. Obstruction statutes, stop and identify laws, and Fourth Amendment protections converge in this moment, highlighting the complex regulatory environment governing enforcement actions. Eder's refusal to provide unnecessary identification is legally justified. Yet the officer's misinterpretation transforms this lawful resistance into grounds for detention. The Bodycam captures these legal tensions in real time, allowing for detailed analysis of both officer behavior and the structural factors that enable overreach. By the conclusion of Part 2, the scene is dominated by the consequences of escalation. The initial suspicion, focused on a routine mechanical task, has been amplified into a full arrest scenario. Institutional reinforcement, misapplied law, and the absence of effective supervisory oversight all contribute to a situation where lawful behavior is punished. The Bodycam footage provides a continuous, unfiltered record of these dynamics, offering crucial insight into the mechanisms of authority misuse and the importance of procedural fidelity in law enforcement. The arrest of Roland Eder, captured in the final segments of the Bodycam footage, crystallizes the consequences of authority unchecked by law. By the time he is handcuffed, the encounter has moved far from its origin. A routine mechanical repair transformed into a high-stakes legal confrontation. Every step leading to this moment demonstrates the compounding effect of minor procedural misjudgments, amplified by institutional reinforcement and psychological pressure. Once in custody, Eder faces not only the immediate physical deprivation of liberty, but the broader implications of public humiliation and potential legal jeopardy. The transcript and bodycam footage reveal the dual layers of impact: the personal, affecting his professional responsibilities and reputation, and the systemic, highlighting gaps in law enforcement training, understanding, and accountability. These layers underscore a key principle in constitutional law. Even minor procedural overreach can carry disproportionate consequences if unchecked. The legal context intensifies the significance of this encounter. Alabama's obstruction statute requires a demonstrable act of hindrance, yet Eder's compliance with lawful requests and refusal to provide unnecessary identification fails to meet that threshold. The subsequent legal proceedings, culminating in the 11th Circuit Court of Appeals, stripping the officers of qualified immunity, illustrate the corrective function of the judiciary. The court's ruling affirms that lawful resistance cannot be criminalized and that officers cannot rely on misapplied statutes or procedural ambiguity to justify overreach. Throughout this phase, the bodycam provides critical insight into officer behavior under scrutiny. Officers McCabe and Perilla operate with confidence, yet that confidence is rooted not in legal clarity but in procedural momentum. They rely on prior assumptions, reinforcement from backup, and the perceived authority of their roles to justify escalation. The footage reveals that without legal recalibration or supervisory intervention, even minor procedural disputes can escalate into constitutional conflicts. The interaction also demonstrates the subtleties of accountability. Officers assert probable cause in real time, yet the court later invalidates this assertion. The footage and transcript illustrate the gap between perceived authority and legal legitimacy, emphasizing the importance of training, oversight, and adherence to statutory limits. This misalignment is emblematic of broader systemic challenges in law enforcement. The cognitive biases of authority, combined with gaps in legal understanding, create conditions ripe for misuse. Eder's civil lawsuit reinforces these lessons. Beyond the immediate vindication, the case sets a precedent regarding qualified immunity and the limits of enforcement authority. By challenging the legal and procedural assumptions underpinning his arrest, Eder forces a reconsideration of institutional norms, highlighting the delicate balance between individual rights and law enforcement discretion. The case demonstrates that accountability is not automatic. It requires vigilance, legal knowledge, and the courage to assert one's rights in the face of institutional power. The bodycam footage also underscores the importance of transparency. The continuous, unedited record allows analysts, courts, and the public to observe procedural details, tonal nuances, and the precise sequence of events. Such documentation is crucial for evaluating claims of obstruction, assessing the proportionality of enforcement, and understanding the human dynamics that influence institutional behavior. In this case, the footage provides incontrovertible evidence of both lawful compliance and procedural overreach. The broader implications of Eder's encounter extend beyond the individual. The case exposes weaknesses in training, oversight, and accountability that, if unaddressed, can lead to repeated constitutional violations. It illustrates how officers, acting under assumptions of authority rather than law, can impose significant consequences on law-abiding citizens. These lessons are critical for policymakers, legal scholars, and law enforcement agencies seeking to prevent similar incidents in the future. Finally, the case underscores the enduring relevance of constitutional protections. The Fourth Amendment, stop and identify statutes, and obstruction laws converge in this scenario, highlighting the complex interplay between law, procedure, and individual rights. Eder's refusal to provide unnecessary identification is not defiance. It is a lawful exercise of constitutional protections. The eventual judicial vindication affirms that these rights are actionable and enforceable, not theoretical constructs. In conclusion, Roland Eder's encounter, captured in real time on Bodycam, offers a comprehensive case study of authority, escalation, and constitutional protection. The footage demonstrates how routine enforcement can become overreach when legal boundaries are misunderstood. Personal bias influences judgment, and institutional momentum replaces reasoned decision-making. Eder's calm, lawful resistance and eventual judicial vindication underscore the necessity of procedural fidelity, oversight, and accountability in preserving constitutional rights. The case serves as a cautionary tale, a guide for law enforcement, and a testament to the enduring importance of vigilance in defending individual liberties against misuse of authority.